Survey data. In this exercise, the first thing we're going to do is complete the gender results comparison table. And you can see here we have the genders on the left side and then the actual relationship status, both no, yes, and the very real, it's complicated. So in order to complete this table, we're going to use a COUNTIFs function because we want to find out how many times each of these happens. So how many females are not in a relationship, how many males are in a relationship, how many in the other category is complicated. Right? We want to fill these all in. And to make it easy on ourselves, we want to create one function and to be able to fill in most of the table. Of course, we'll do the percentage after, but the actual counting of the numbers we want to do all at once. So let's go ahead and start a COUNTIFs function. And what are we trying to count? Well, the first thing we're counting over here, I'm going to start on the left side, although you could do it either way. I want to find out in this gender column how many are female, male, or other. So let's go ahead and grab that, all that content. Good start. So that's my criteria range, that's the column. And what am I looking for in that range? What's the criterion? Well, I am looking for, oops, if I can get this to scroll down. I am looking for, in this case, female. Easy enough. Now, my second criterion range, I'm going to grab all my relationships, and I'm just using the Control-Shift down arrow or Command-Shift down arrow if you're working on a Mac. And what am I looking for in here? Well, since I'm in this cell, I'm looking for female and no. Great. Alright, and I have 143 females that are not in a relationship. Awesome. But we can't actually copy this over or down until we freeze some of the cells. So we're going to lock some of these by putting in the dollar signs. Or you can use your Command T or your F4. I want you to see that I'm locking the rows and the columns for both of the ranges. I'm going to come back to the other ones so we can talk through the logic. Alright, so the ranges are frozen. That's good because I never want these to change, the lookup, the criteria ranges. Now let's come back to this H24. In my case, that's what I have, but female. Alright, for female, I do, when I copy the function down, or this formula down, I do want it to change to male. So I want the row to be able to change. But when I copy this formula over, I don't all of a sudden want it to start grabbing these cells. So I want the column to be frozen while the rows can move. So I'm just going to freeze the column. Now when I go over to my no, because that's the value I want to look up, sometimes I do want it to be yes, and it's complicated. So I do want the columns to change from this one to the next to the next. But I don't ever want it to move down because then instead of grabbing these values, it's going to grab values in these cells, and that's not what I want. So I do want the column to be able to change, but I don't want the row to be able to change. So I'll freeze that. And of course it gives me the same number, but now I can copy it over and I can copy it down. And then percent complicated, well, you're trying to figure out the percent that's complicated, so in this case it's going to be this 36. Of course you're grabbing all these values and you're not actually typing them in, divided by the total for females. So this is percent complicated for all of the females, and then the males, and then other. So I'll let you finish that, and we will move down to creating the pivot table. Okay, moving down, we are now going to create a pivot table to summarize the data. So essentially we're doing something very similar, but we're going to build this example pivot table, or try to recreate this example pivot table, instead of using the functions and formulas like we did in the top table. Okay, so let's start by inserting a pivot table. And it's asking me for my data. Go ahead and select all of your data, including the headings. So I'll grab those and then use my keyboard shortcut to grab all the way down to the bottom of my data. And I want to put this in an existing worksheet, and the location, well, that big old yellow cell that says place pivot. Okay, it says there's already data in there, and yes, there is, because there is. That's where we put it. And now we have these fields to choose from, so we actually want to build this pivot table. And remember, as we can see here, each row in this gender area, the row is female, so the genders are rows. That's how we know we want to take gender and put it in row. Now across the top we have our relationship status, so these are our columns. They go down each of these columns. So I'm going to go ahead and grab relationship and put it in my columns. That's a good start. I'm going to scroll over just a little bit so you can see a bit more, because now we have not just yes and no, we have the count and we have the percentage. So how do we do that? Well, we have our rows and columns set, that's good. Let's go ahead and grab our relationship again, this field, and put it into percent values. And that by default is going to give us the count of. Perfect, that's exactly what we want. That gives us our count. But we also want percentages, so we're going to grab relationship again and drag it down into percent values. This gives us two sets. I'm going to zoom out so you can see. This gives us two sets of the relationship data. Now they all say count of, and one says count of relationship 2. We'll fix that in a minute. The issue is it's giving us the same data twice. So we have the count, the count, the count, the count, the count. Okay, we don't want that. So we're going to click the drop down arrow or the little I next to the count of. If I can make this a little wider. In my screenshot, but when I click that drop down arrow, you're going to go all the way down to value field settings. And that gives us this area here. Now we can change two things in here. One, we don't want it to show count of relationship, we actually want it to show the percentage. And what do we want to show? How do we want to show it? Well, we want to show it differently. Okay, we don't want just the count. We want to show it as a percentage. And a percentage of what? Well, we want to show a percentage of each gender. So how many of the females are in a complicated relationship, or no relationship, or they are in a relationship. And the gender go across our rows. So we want to show the percent of the row total. Press OK. And now that gives us our percentages. Now while we're in there, or go back in there, that value field settings, let's go ahead and format our number as well. So if you click this bottom left hand corner, we can format this. Unfortunately, the directions and the example are different, so it tells us to show 0 decimal places, and then the example shows 1, so go ahead and do either. But if we change this to a percentage, as it already is, I'm going to follow the directions and do 0, press OK, and now it comes out to even percentages. Let's do a little bit more formatting, and one of the things we want to format first is right now our pivot table shows row labels and column labels, but it doesn't actually say what they are. So the column label is going to be our relationship status, and our row labels are gender. You can just click and type over those. And we changed the heading for each of these percentage columns by going down in the values and clicking the little I or the drop down arrow, but you can also in a pivot table just click right on the pivot table and change it. And once you change one of those, they will all change. So all of the related columns will change automatically. Now you probably have noticed that this table is really hard to read, and part of the reason it's so hard to read is because everything's not centered. So let's go ahead and also center all of this. And that makes it a heck of a lot easier to read, as you can see. Alright, so we're much better off than we were before. But let's see, there are a couple of other things we want to adjust, and the directions ask us to only show the column totals, and right now we have column totals down here, and we have row totals. So to get rid of that, click in your pivot table, go up to Design, and click the drop down arrow next to grand totals, and we want on for columns only, which will get rid of our row totals and also shrinks it down considerably to make it a little bit easier to read. Now there are two last things that I want to point out with this pivot table. The first one is showing the count is good because that actually shows what the real data is. Showing percentages, however, usually give you a better feel for, in general, what's going on. So for example, if you saw that 190 men versus 105 women were in relationships, you might assume that, okay, there are more men are in more relationships than women, except if you look over at the percentage, you see it's actually a little bit higher for the females than it is males. So showing percentages is often a more fair comparison. That being said, if you look at the other category for gender, there are only 3 that put that in our data set, so you can't, because it's such a small number of the actual population, you can't really say that it's always going to be a third in yes, no, or it's complicated. So be careful not to actually extrapolate this out and assume it's for the entire class, because not everyone filled out the survey, or the entire university. So this is just describing this particular data set, so keep that in mind. Additionally, as you see here, pivot tables are great because they summarize data, but when you have multiple columns under one heading, it's kind of hard to read that. So if you were going to put this into an actual presentation, I would highly recommend actually copy pasting this pivot table and doing some extra formatting, or taking it and putting it in some other format just to make it a little bit easier to read. You could change maybe some colors to designate that this section is, it's complicated, these 2 are for no, and these 2 are for yes. Unfortunately, you can't use the merge and center command in a pivot table, but you could if you actually take this pivot table, copy, paste it into regular Excel cells, so if you paste them as values out of a pivot table, you then could put it somewhere else to format it really nicely if you're going to present it. So just keep those 2 things in mind as you're moving forward and using pivot tables more often.